They didn't fear the gun as much as they feared the man holding it, because in the American West of the late 19th century, there were killers, there were outlaws, and then there was John Wesley Hardin, a man whose reputation moved faster than any horse and whose presence alone was often enough to end arguments before they began. Hardin was born in Texas into a world where violence was not an exception, but a condition. His father was a preacher and school teacher, a man who believed discipline and scripture could shape character. But the land Hardin grew up on followed different rules. Reconstruction-era Texas was raw, unstable, and deeply divided. Authority was contested, justice was inconsistent. And young men learned early that survival often depended on how quickly they could respond to threat. John Wesley Hardin learned faster than most. By his mid-teens, Hardin had already crossed a line few ever return from. His first killing came not after a long descent into crime, but abruptly, violently, and decisively. A confrontation escalated. A gun was drawn, and in that moment, something in Hardin locked into place. He did not hesitate, he did not miss. And after it was over, he did not collapse under guilt or shock. He adapted. That response terrified people far more than rage ever could. Hardin did not kill for spectacle. He killed for certainty. He believed that hesitation invited death, and that mercy was a luxury the West did not allow. Each violent encounter reinforced that belief. Each survival hardened it. And with every year, Hardin's reputation grew, not through exaggeration alone, but through a trail of bodies that followed him from town to town. Unlike many outlaws, Hardin was not reckless. He studied people. He watched how men moved, how they spoke, how their hands hovered near weapons. He slept lightly. He positioned himself carefully in rooms. He chose seats that gave him vision and advantage. Violence to him was not chaos. It was calculation. Texas lawmen quickly realized they were dealing with something different. Hardin was not driven by greed or ideology. He was driven by a belief system forged in blood, that the world was hostile and survival required dominance. Attempts to arrest him often failed because he anticipated them. Deputies underestimated him and paid for it. Others chose not to pursue him at all. By the time Hardin reached his early 20s, he had killed more men than many infamous outlaws would in an entire lifetime. Some deaths were disputed, others were undeniable. What mattered most was not the exact number, but the pattern. When trouble found Hardin, it ended violently, almost always in his favor. Communities reacted in two ways. Some wanted him gone at any cost. Others wanted him nearby, believing that a man so dangerous could also be protective if kept on the right side. This contradiction allowed Hardin to move through the West with surprising freedom, slipping between towns, identities, and allegiances. Violence has gravity. It pulls consequences toward it whether a man believes himself justified or not. Every killing narrowed Hardin's options. Every escape shortened the distance between him and the inevitable reckoning he refused to believe applied to him. Hardin saw himself not as a villain, but as a product of his environment. A man who did what was necessary when others could not. And for a time, the West seemed to agree. He survived encounters that should have ended him. He walked away from confrontations that left others dead. He outpaced the law again and again. But the American West was changing. Railroads connected towns. Law hardened. Patience for men like Hardin thinned. The space where dominance could masquerade as necessity began to close. And the man who had mastered violence was about to face a reality he could not shoot his way out of. As even in the Wild West, there comes a moment when the question is no longer how deadly you are, but how long the world will allow you to remain so. As John Wesley Hardin moved from town to town, his name began to arrive before he did. In the American West, reputation was a form of currency, and Hardin's was paid for in fear. Men who might have challenged others chose silence when they recognized him. Arguments ended abruptly. Glances lingered on his hands instead of his face. Violence did not always need to happen anymore, because the possibility of it was enough. Hardin understood this power instinctively. He cultivated awareness without theatrics. He did not boast loudly in saloons or announce himself as a killer. He simply carried himself with the confidence of someone who had already crossed the worst line imaginable and survived. That quiet certainty unsettled people far more than bravado ever could. It suggested a man who did not need to prove anything. Yet the West around him was unstable in ways even Hardin could not fully control. Reconstruction-era Texas was fractured, with federal authority clashing against local loyalties. Lawmen were often outmatched, underpaid, or politically constrained. In this vacuum, men like Hardin thrived. When rules are unclear, personal codes take over, and Hardin's code was brutally simple. Strike first, survive, move on. Encounters with law enforcement became increasingly frequent. Some deputies sought him out, hoping to build a reputation by bringing him in. Others avoided him entirely, understanding that arresting Hardin was not a routine procedure, but a gamble with lethal odds. More than one officer underestimated him, mistaking his youth for recklessness. Those mistakes ended in funerals. Hardin's killings were often framed by him as self-defense, and in some cases, the law struggled to contradict that claim. Witnesses were reluctant. Evidence was scarce. Jurisdiction was fragmented. The West, still learning how to prosecute violence consistently, often failed to contain him. Each escape reinforced Hardin's belief that he was operating within a world where survival justified outcome. If this story is pulling you in, take a moment now. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment below whether you believe men like Hardin were shaped by the West, or whether they shaped it through fear. As his notoriety expanded, so did the pressure. Hardin could no longer remain in one place for long. He adopted aliases, altered his appearance, and traveled constantly. Sleep became lighter. Trust narrowed. Even allies were temporary. The same instincts that had kept him alive now isolated him, cutting him off from stability and permanence. Violence followed him like a shadow. Some confrontations were unavoidable. Others were provoked by men seeking to test the legend. Hardin responded the same way every time. This consistency solidified his myth but eroded any chance of redemption. The West began to see him less as a man reacting to danger and more as danger itself. Yet beneath the hardened exterior, cracks began to form. Constant vigilance wears on even the most ruthless survivors. Hardin's world had become a series of exits, ambushes, and calculated risks. There was no future in it, only continuation. The idea of normal life, family, permanence, legitimacy, receded further with every mile he traveled. Meanwhile, the institutions he had once outrun were strengthening. Railroads accelerated communication. Law enforcement networks improved coordination. The gap between outlaw and authority narrowed. Hardin sensed the shift, even if he refused to acknowledge its implications. The environment that had allowed him to flourish was slowly disappearing. What had once been a frontier of opportunity for violent men was becoming a system that demanded accountability. Hardin had survived through dominance. The coming era would test whether dominance alone was enough, because reputation can intimidate, but none of them can stop. Time was finally catching up to John Wesley Hardin. As the West continued to change, John Wesley Hardin found himself running not just from lawmen, but from time itself. The railroads shrank distance. Telegraph lines erased isolation. What once took days to communicate now took minutes. For a man who had survived by staying one step ahead, the margin for error was collapsing. Every town felt smaller, every road felt watched, and every encounter carried the risk of final exposure. Hardin's movements grew more erratic. He traveled under false names, altered his appearance, and relied on a shrinking circle of people willing to help him. The confidence that had once defined him hardened into paranoia. He slept with weapons close, avoided familiar patterns, and trusted almost no one. The hunter's instincts that had served him so well now trapped him in a constant state of readiness that left no room for rest. Violence still followed him, but its nature changed. No longer was it simply reactionary. Some confrontations were preemptive, driven by the belief that any delay could be fatal. This mindset ensured survival in the short term, but it also deepened the legal and moral case against him. Killing, regardless of circumstance, tightened the net closing around him. The law, once fragmented and hesitant, became patient. Hardin was no longer pursued impulsively. He was studied. Patterns were analyzed. Associates were watched. Authorities understood that capturing him would not come through force alone, but through waiting for the moment when his own momentum would betray him. That moment came not in a dramatic shootout, but in exhaustion. In 1877, Hardin was finally captured aboard a train in Florida. There was no blaze of gunfire, no last stand. The most lethal man of the Old West was taken quietly, almost anticlimactically. For someone who had built his life around violent control, the absence of violence at the end was the cruelest irony of all. Hardin was returned to Texas to face justice. The trial stripped away legend and reduced him to record. Witnesses testified. Names were spoken. Deaths were counted. For the first time, Hardin could not outrun consequence. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison, a term that might as well have been a lifetime for a man defined by motion. Prison transformed Hardin in ways the frontier never could. Deprived of weapons, freedom, and constant threat, he turned inward. He read extensively. He studied law. He reflected on his life with a clarity that survival had never allowed. Hardin began to reframe his past not as destiny, but as a series of choices made under pressure, choices that now carried permanent weight. Yet even behind bars, his reputation lingered. Guards treated him cautiously. Inmates avoided provoking him. The myth did not vanish simply because the man was confined. It followed him into confinement, reshaped but intact. Years passed. The world outside evolved. The West became more settled, more bureaucratic, less tolerant of personal justice. When Hardin was eventually released early for good behavior, he emerged into a society that no longer resembled the one that had produced him. He was older, slower, and out of place. The skills that had once kept him alive now held little value. The world no longer rewarded lethal certainty. It demanded restraint, legitimacy, and submission to systems Hardin had never respected. Freedom returned to him in name only. The hardest truth Hardin would face was not prison. It was discovering that the West no longer needed a man like him, and that realization would set the stage for his final act. When John Wesley Hardin walked free from prison, the West he stepped into no longer resembled the one that had forged him. The streets were more orderly, the law more present. Violence, once an accepted language of survival, had become a liability. Hardin carried his past like a shadow, but the world around him had learned to move without it. For the first time in his life, he was not feared for what he might do next. He was watched for what he might try. Hardin attempted reinvention. He studied law, passed the bar, and presented himself as a man transformed by reflection and discipline. On paper, it was a remarkable reversal. The deadliest gunman of the Old West now seeking legitimacy through the very system he had spent his youth defying. But reinvention is harder when reputation precedes intent. Clients hesitated. Colleagues distrusted him. Every interaction was filtered through the memory of who he had been. He could not escape confrontation, even when he no longer sought it. Men challenged him out of resentment, curiosity, or the desire to test whether the legend still lived beneath the suit and books. Hardin, older and slower, responded with words instead of gunfire when he could. But restraint did not erase instinct. The man who had survived by decisive violence could never fully shed the reflexes that had kept him alive. The final years of Hardin's life were marked by tension rather than triumph. He moved through saloons and courtrooms alike as a man caught between eras, too dangerous for the past, too damaged for the future. His attempts at normalcy were constantly undermined by disputes, grudges, and unresolved anger. Peace remained just out of reach, not because he could not see it, but because his life had been built in opposition to it. In 1895, the reckoning arrived not as a duel, not as a chase, but as an execution born of personal grievance. John Wesley Hardin was shot from behind in a saloon in El Paso. There was no warning, no chance to react, no opportunity to prove whether he had truly changed. The fastest gun of the Old West died without drawing his weapon. His death was almost poetic in its cruelty. A man who had lived by vigilance and dominance was undone by a moment he could not control. The West did not defeat him in a fair fight. It simply moved on without him, leaving him exposed to the same randomness he had once mastered. History remembers Hardin in numbers, body counts debated endlessly, motives argued, justifications dissected, but the truth of his life is not found in tallies, it is found in the trajectory. Hardin was not born a monster. He was shaped by instability, rewarded by survival, and ultimately consumed by a world that no longer required his skills. He was both a product of the Old West and evidence of why it had to end. John Wesley Hardin did not lose because he was weak. He lost because the conditions that had allowed him to thrive disappeared. The same environment that created him rejected him when it evolved. That is the final lesson of his life. Violence may offer control and chaos, but it guarantees nothing once order arrives. If this story made you reconsider the legends of the Wild West, take a moment now. Leave a like to support honest long-form history. Subscribe to the channel for stories that strip myth down to consequence. And comment below. Do you believe John Wesley Hardin was a victim of his time, or the architect of his own downfall? Because in the end, the deadliest man of the Old West was not killed by a faster gun. He was killed by a world that no longer needed him.